what I want to go over. I'm going to throw 2 vessels, and then I'm going to decorate them using different sorts of slips, right? Or one of them we'll do with the flocculated slip, which is kind of the thicker slip that we made last week. And then the other one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put sodium silicate on it, bust out my blowtorch, dry all that sodium silicate and stretch it out, and we'll get like a really interesting crackle texture from that, which next week we're going to go over inlay techniques, right? So that would be your Mishima, all that sort of jazz where you carve and then color, right? And we'll be able to do that with one of the pieces that I make today. So I have roughly 2 pounds of clay here. I'm going to kind of work through centering this pretty quickly, but I will describe what I'm doing as I'm going just so you guys have a refresher, right? So clay's on the wheel, hands and clay's really wet. I like to do this like kind of spidery thing at the beginning where I just kind of lean in on it and then my fingertips kind of curl under. That sort of seals it to the wheel head, right? It's also much closer to center now. Then I'll do the coning up, coning down thing. So basically I make the chair hand here, make an opposite chair hand, squeeze them together, rise up as I do, make a cone, take that chair, push it down like so. And from here, it's just a rinse and repeat, right? This is also known as wheel wedging. So this kind of does the same thing that wedging does, where it gets all of your molecules lined up correctly, right? We want them all to be spinning the same direction. That way, hopefully, we won't get anywhere near as much warpage. So squeeze them together, rise up, fold down like so. And it's kind of centered itself in that process, right? So like once you start working towards like 3 to 6 pounds of clay, like centering becomes much more difficult. It's kind of crazy if you go up pound increments how much harder it is to center. So keep that in mind because this is very helpful for centering big pieces of clay, right? I'm going to finish off doing a little chair karate chop. I'm going to come in with my finger guns from the back, trace in until I find the very center, and then I'm going to exaggerate that center a little bit. That way I can put water in there, drop the well as it were. I push down at a 45-degree angle with my finger guns until I get to roughly pottery thickness, which is that like 1/4 inch, you know what I mean? Which we're there. I'm going to be making a pretty tall, thick cylinder for this because I'm going to start out with the sodium silicate. So I'm not pulling out my base very far. And then I'm going to spend some time compressing. And then everything needs to, if I'm trying to pull a cylinder, I need to really try to pull a volcano shape. So what I'm going to do is kind of lean in on the clay, make it more volcano shaped from the get-go. And now I'm going to start my pulling. So all this, you guys can see my wheels going crazy fast. I slow it down quite a bit once I get to pulling because otherwise it's going to turn into a bowl. So roughly there is good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to pull a really tall, really narrow, thick cylinder. So I'm not going to go crazy on trying to have perfect pulls, right? What I'm trying to build is height here because I'm going to lose a lot of that height when I widen this out to be more like a moon jar. So just keep everything nice and thick. Then every once in a while, because I'm trying to get height and not width, I'll come in and I'll collar the whole thing starting from pretty much the very bottom. That way I maintain like a really thick wall. Try to get some of this skirt clay, worked into height. Like so. And when I say really tall, it's like because it's so thick, it's not going to be super, super tall, right? But I want it to be as tall as I can get it to make the rest of my process easier. And so roughly here is usually where I'll stop. I don't want to overdo it and like have it be too thin, right? I'd rather have more thickness than I need. So my walls are probably a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick, right? And that's on purpose because we're going to be stretching this out quite a bit. So I am going to take a second, cut off a little bit of that skirt, and then also rib the sides to get rid of any of that slip because we don't need it. Now that we have this nice and dry, we can move on to our next steps. So, usually you can skip the step I'm about to do, but I prefer this like brown clay body with a white slip over it. I think it looks prettier, you know what I mean, especially under glaze. So I'm going to take a second and paint some slip on here. I had a brush, there we go. And this is that flocculated slip. This isn't necessary at all to this process. I'm just pinning it on because I want it to be white. I'm careful not to linger too long in one spot because I don't want to dye this slip kind of red. You know what I mean? So I'm just painting on, moving down a little bit, getting some more, so on and so forth. I'll go all the way to the bottom even though I'm going to cut some of that off. So if you like that brown clay surface, you wouldn't do this part at all. We'll go up like that. We've got a decently even surface, and like you can see there's a little bit of variation there as far as thickness and thinness goes. I usually don't mind that too much, especially because we're going to do so much to it afterwards, right? Then I'm going to clean this guy out. Does anyone have any questions real quick while we're cleaning this out? Feels pretty good. We're just throwing right now, so. Next, what I have here is sodium silicate, right? Which is a deflocculant, so it's kind of the opposite of the process I use to make this thick, or this slip thicker. So sodium silicate is usually used to make things thinner, right? So for like casting slips, that sort of thing. Another cool thing with it is it becomes like really rigid, and then when you stretch it crackles, which is what we're going to be using it for, right? So I'm actually, because that slip is on there and it's wet, I'm going to blowtorch it. And we want a dry surface from the get-go. And I'm not as concerned about the top or the bottom because the middle is really where the most stretching is going to happen. And so if you get down on eye level with it, you can see where it's shiny. I want it to not be shiny. And now it's gone from fully glossy to more of a matte texture. And I don't want to overdo this because I'm not trying to dry out my clay, right? But I do want it dry enough to where I can paint this on and I'm not just smearing, right? So while this is going, we'll put some sodium silicate on there. And I'm going to put it all over. Even though we're mainly going to be stretching the middle out, but we might as well. And you can see like I have very little of the white or the brown on my brush because I dried it beforehand, right? So now, I mean, it works well. It's so much more fun than using a heat gun for this. Although the good thing about a heat gun is you can kind of just like set it on a brick and forget it. You shouldn't do that because I don't know if you've seen, there's one or two wheels that have a melted splash pan because someone was like, oh, just use this heat gun and I'll go like for lunch real quick, right? And that's dangerous. But same process here, right? Like this is shiny and I want it to not be shiny. So now what we're gonna do is we need to stretch it, right? But I don't want to stretch it how I would traditionally stretch something where I kind of use both hands to make sure it's really even. I'm only gonna stretch it from the inside. Now, if I do this with a wet hand, it's just going to spiral, or it's not going to spiral at all, it's just going to stretch out this way, right? If I do it with a dry hand and a dry inside, it's going to stretch and torque around because of the friction, so the crackles will have kind of like a spirally sort of nature to them, right? So I'm going to try it. Easiest way would be to use moisture, right? But like it's a little less dangerous, but like let's just go for it and try to use dry hand, right? So I'm going to try to dry out as much of the slip from the inside as I can. Using this, because this is also just a big rib when you need it to be, right? And then I'm just going to go in here, trying to, it's tricky when you have white hands. So you guys can already kind of see, like it's starting to stretch just a smidge, right? Just from where my hand went in there. It might be hard to see on camera. Let's spin it around a little bit. Let's just keep going. It'll be much more obvious in just a second, right? I'm going to try to spend more time stretching out the middle because I want the middle, I mean, I want it to still be kind of like a vase, right? And I don't want it to just be like a bowl. There you go. That's a little bit more obvious, right? We'll keep going down. You can also use, they make tools for this, right, that are basically just like a big piece of wood that's got like a knob on the end of it where you can stretch the insides of things, right? You can also just use this part of your wooden knife tool. Think of it kind of like a finger, right? So I'm going to use that to stretch, starting from like the lower third and then working up. And then stopping, right? Clean that off. Lower third, working out, working up, stopping at like the upper third. Right, so I'll stop it real quick so you guys can sort of see the texture that we have so far. This is also interesting, right? So next week we're gonna, basically all the cracks I'm gonna inlay with a color, but because we had brown clay and white slip, you technically don't have to. It's already a darker color underneath it, right? Just a little bit more visually interesting from the get-go if you put slip on something before you do the sodium silicate crackle, right? For my hand builders, you can also use this process. What I do is I paint slip on a slab, let it dry, right? Then I paint sodium silicate on a slab, let it dry, and then, so I'll have a slab maybe 3/4 of the way stretched out, do the slip, do the sodium silicate, let it dry, stretch it the last quarter, and you'll get this sort of same kind of kohiki crackle technique, right? So now it's just a rinse and repeat. And I'm just trying to get some volume on here because I know I left this really thick, so I know I have the clay to do it. But I'm not going to be greedy with it because I don't want this demo to take forever. And also I'm fine to have a vase that's not super, super thin, right? It doesn't really matter. It's not an object you pick up very often. So I don't mind if it's thick. But you guys can see I am taking multiple sort of goes at this, right? I didn't try to just stretch it all in one go because I don't want to overwork the clay.
How many pounds of clay was that?
This was roughly 2. I feel like I'm getting a little thin on the bottom there now, so I'm going to ease off a little bit. Yeah, I would just, instead of making such a tall cylinder, I would make kind of a lower, wider squatter cylinder and still try to throw it pretty tall because I'm not going to be able to do any more pulling afterwards, right? And we're just going to do stretching. You can see, like, the more I stretch, the sort of more the crevasses grow on that, right?
Very cool.
So from here, I'm going to go on the inside and try to stretch just to sort of feel how thin it feels because I don't want to overdo it and lose it. And it's not a perfect sort of sphere shape, so I'm going to spend a second trying to make that a little bit better too, right? So I'm going to come in on the inside. A lot of this process is easier to do with my hands, but getting my hands in there when it's dry on the inside is a little tricky. So I'm going to lubricate my hands, being very careful not to get any moisture on the outside. So from here, we're just going to do some stretching with my fingertips. Then I can feel how much I have left. We're getting close there. We'll go to roughly there. So like a pretty classic kind of, you know what I mean, verging on moon vase shape. Now that I have it wide enough for my hand to go through, I can actually come in and mop that water out, which is super important, right? So we'll do that. The last thing I'll do is I left the rim really thick too, right? So what I'm going to do is try to very carefully, with as minimal moisture as possible, throw the rim up a little bit. And it's okay if I lose that white slip there, I'm fine with that. Not going to overdo it because I can see it's wanting to sort of wobble on me. So instead, we're just going to widen this out a bit. Like so. And then any part where I kind of muddy it like that, I usually come in and sort of scrape the slip away there. So that it looks intentional and not like, oh, I messed up. Like so. And I'll probably do the same thing to the bottom where I cut off a little bit right from that sort of skirt area. And it is, oh yeah, it's wanting to collapse on me down here. Stretched it a little hard. So I will take care of that once we get to the trimming stage. But for the most part, like how you do sodium silicate crackle texture, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool, well that's one of them. All right, y'all, let's get situated again. This last demo is real quick. I already threw the shape for you because you guys saw me throw the first one, right? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to be using this kind of thicker, goopy slip. It doesn't have to be the like flocculated, like chemically thickened slip. If you made your own slip and you just didn't add very much water to it, same thing would work there, right? You can paint this on, But I find I like this more as a textural element than just like the fact that it paints it white. So what I usually do is kind of using my hand as like a, I don't know, sort of a funnel, you know what I mean? Is I'll actually pour this into my hand and down onto the pot. Work my way down, and this is how I can build up like a nice thick layer of it. Go all the way to the rim like that. And like you guys can see already, it's like texturally like is doing a lot, right?
Very cool.
So what I'm going to do is while it's spinning, I'm going to give it stripes by just moving my finger through the slip. And then it'll, if it's depending on the thickness, right, the stripes will either stay or they will sort of start to sag like this. So I might have like a little bit too much of a thick layer. So I'm going to spend a second kind of re-solidifying that thickness there. Because too much will automatically sort of goop off on you, and that's not necessarily what I want. Let's try it from there. Point being, like, I don't mind that it's leaving like these sort of big, interesting marks in there. That's kind of the point. You know what I mean? But just so I don't have like one ring of super goopy, I'm just spending some time trying to even it out a little bit. Like that. From here, should be able to work our way up, and not only have like a spiral visually as far as like the contrast there goes, but should theoretically have like parts where it's thicker, parts where it's thinner, right? And then I'm going to do the thing where I want it to sort of sag on me by doing this. But you can see, like, I end up with parts that kind of bleed into the next part, and like I've got little bits of drip up here. Like, I just think it's a visually interesting thing to do, and also it's kind of a fun demo. But you also have to throw a pot that you're like comfortable will survive this. If I had thrown this really crazy thin, really delicately, or it was a shape like that one, for sure it would have collapsed, right? That's why a lot of times I do things in like cylinders, or sort of cylinders that angle in, because it's a really strong shape. I know that I could like theoretically like drop this, do it this way to get the same sort of effect.
I feel a little safer.
I don't know, this is cooler though, you know? Get gravity on my side. But that's pretty much it, right? I just wanted to show you like the things you could do with the flocculated slip based on the fact that it's thicker. You know what I mean? That's sort of the point of it, is not only does it give you like a visual color-wise, but like it also adds some textural elements there, right? Sometimes what I'll do on a piece like this is I'll use a really crappy like scraggly brush, and I'll brush through the slip, and that'll give me really good lines to then inlay with like black underglaze or something like that, because it's very sharp lines that will hold that that inlay medium well.